Um, so good morning, dear participants and faculty members from different schools. This is one unique initiative taken care by R&D Cell and IQAC. Because you are doing good in publication, research, and also University of Hyderabad is good in publishing lot many impactful articles. But to make the ecosystem more strengther and stronger, we invite people like Professor Henrik to do workshop and to train the researchers how to write good journal papers and what are the ethics we have to follow so that the University of Hyderabad research output or outcome will be more stronger and more strengther, right? So with this, we'll start this workshop. This workshop will be from 11:30 to 12:30. It may go till lunchtime. Now I request Professor Srikanth to give an introduction about Professor Henrik, then we'll start.
Yeah, good morning to you all. Welcome to this workshop. It is indeed pleasure and honor to have Professor Rudolph as a distinguished visitor to our university. Professor Rudolph is a renowned material scientist with surface science interventions. He obtained his BSc and MSc degrees from Copenhagen University, and then subsequently did his PhD in molecular physics from Caltech, and then joined Utrecht University as a faculty. Utrecht is a beautiful place in Netherlands. Then he continued there till 2012, and then moved to Netherlands Defense Academy, run by Ministry of Defense in Netherlands. There he was a dean in one faculty, and subsequently he is now Professor Emeritus in the National Netherlands Academy of Defense. We are very pleased to have you here. Thank you for coming here. And he's coming here as an editor-in-chief of the renowned journal Applied Surface Science, published by Elsevier. He has been the editor-in-chief since 2005, and under his leadership, Applied Surface Science has been publishing quality research works. And fortunately, School of Engineering Sciences and Technology also has a couple of papers in that journal. Let me also welcome Dr. Ranjini. Welcome to your alma mater. She represents Elsevier. We are thankful to you for coming here, and we hope that we all get benefited from your workshop. Thank you, Professor Rudolph. And I now request Professor Rudolph to start his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me either through the microphone or directly. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the fact that you actually found out that I was actually started in 2005 as an editor. You're not supposed to know that because we've forgotten about that. No, I'm not kidding, because you're only supposed to be at the most for 6 years with a journal. So once again, Dr. Srey is here on behalf of Elsevier. She is fully employed by Elsevier, and she would very much like to connect with you also if you have any questions about journals, good ideas for making new things. So I would strongly recommend, not during my presentation, but afterwards, that you try to get hold of her email address and ideas about how to interact with Elsevier, and for that matter, specifically on the interest, obviously, on the science part of it. Before we get started, I would like to say that you're more than welcome to ask questions. I have one warning, that is that I did this presentation in a more elaborate version at the IIT Delhi. It was supposed to last 2.5 hours. It ended up taking 5 hours. So if you want to skip lunch, I brought my storage here, so I'm good. But for you guys, it might not be a good idea. But ask questions, and if you have a question, I have a small gift I'll give you. Very small gift. But nevertheless, questions are more than welcome also during the presentation. Do not hesitate, please, and ask me. So yesterday, I was at IIT here in Hyderabad, and I asked each and everyone as they came in through the door, where are you from, what are you doing, etc., etc. Well, today, first of all, I arrived late, and secondly, there are so many of you here that I will not do that, but I assume you're all sort of at least interested in scientific publishing. So what I'm going to talk about today is not specifically for my journal or for a number of other journals that I'm associated with. It's much more general about how it is to be an author and how you actually communicate with the journal, what things to do and what things not to do, because there are some do's and don'ts. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to find, if you know the expression, to find the needle in the haystack. So here you have someone who's trying to find the needle in the haystack. And you can see it's a big needle, but still he's not finding it. That's very much the feeling you might have when you're about to write an article. It's tough sometimes to find that specific needle you need in order to get into that specific journal. We'll talk a little bit about how to select a journal. We'll also tell you a little bit about what I call quality indices. And for that matter, if you're very much interested, we can also talk about some of the tools you can use and some of the tools you may not want to use. Okay, but before we get started, as you heard, I'm from the Netherlands, Holland. Holland is a very small place up here in the north of Europe. And it actually consists the Kingdom of the Netherlands, because it's a kingdom. We have a king, we have a queen. The queen is actually from Argentina down here. But he's very much Dutch, except actually he's half German because his father was German. And it consists out of the Netherlands in Europe, plus a number of smaller islands that are actually some of them independent countries. Now, this is going to be recorded. It'll be on YouTube, and you can do it privately. I would like to have a copy of the recording, and I would like to have a few of the pictures you take. So please take also some picture of the people here. So, you know, if they ever send me an email, then I know, okay, yeah, we have them. This is the Netherlands. For those of you who may or may not know it, we have down here in the south a town called Maastricht. There's a big river going through it that's called Maas. And actually, it ends up here. And from down here in the south to up in the north, the very, very top, is about 300 kilometers. On a good day, you can do that in about 3.5 hours. In a good day, meaning not too much traffic. You can typically drive during the day 100 kilometers an hour on the freeways, and you can drive 130 at night. Not that I want to recommend it, because a lot of people will be even driving faster, but that can become very, very expensive in the Netherlands. Anyway, here in the islands, one of the biggest ones is actually called Curacao. It's very close actually to the border of Venezuela. So maybe you don't know this, but actually the Kingdom of the Netherlands has a border with Venezuela in South America. Strange to think about, because as a matter of fact, our Navy is responsible for sailing around these islands and making sure that nobody else is coming into them. You might think, why would they want to come there? Well, there's something called drugs, and a lot of people in Europe want some of that, and they come through Venezuela, Colombia, and what have you, and they end up there. And as a matter of fact, a lot of that is coming from there and going up to Florida. And we also have a border with France. Well, for those of you who may not know it, down here we actually have Belgium, and in here we have Germany, and France is one country further south. But actually one of the islands up there, it's called Saint Martin, is actually shared with France. So we have a border with France also. Trust me, if you go to the Netherlands and ask someone from the Netherlands, a Dutchman, so have you ever been to the border with France? They'll say, yeah, but that was between Belgium and France. They would never know that actually the Netherlands has a border with France. But putting things in perspective, okay, you all know India, 3.3 million square kilometers. Big. The Netherlands, 41. So it's about almost the ratio between the rupees and the euro, 90 times, okay? Just to put it in perspective, 1.4 billion people, and still growing in India. In the Netherlands, in 17.3, and we actually growing only because we have people trying to get as refugees into the country. Our own population as such is not really growing. We have a tough time convincing the young people to have kids. Small side note, I left on the 26th. Sorry, I was supposed to leave on the 25th, but then the 26th, which would have been your birth of the Republic, is also the birthday of my wife. She didn't think that was a great idea, so I left on Saturday, the 27th. Unfortunately, by the time I came on the ground in Delhi, my first grandchild had been born, so I will be sleeping in the doghouse when I get home. Anyway, so the ratio is 1 to about 90 or 80 something. Okay? You know that there is a lot of farming going on in India. Does anyone have anyone in the family working in farming? Typically, all these academians, they never have anyone. Anyway, there are a lot of farming going on in India. No surprise. We buy some of the farm products. We buy basmati rice from India. We buy the Darjeeling tea from India. How big do you think the ratio is between the agricultural export expressed in whatever dollars of India compared to the Netherlands? So the ratio in size and population is about 1 to 90. What do you think the ratio is in the agricultural export in value between the Netherlands and India? Make an educated guess. Sorry, 1 to 500. So you think that the Indian is 500 times as big as the Dutch? Okay. Anyone else? Okay, I can say close but no bananas, because I know bananas are very cheap here in India. I heard yesterday it cost less than 100 rupees for 12. Is that correct? Okay, you can have 12 bananas then for me, because you're way off. Anyone else? Come on. If you're getting close, I'll give you a small gift. Come on, anyone. You. The young lady there laughing a little bit like, don't see me. Speak up. What do you think? How much? You're a scientist. You're supposed to be able to estimate things, okay? So you make what is called a guesstimate. That's a guess, that is an estimate. That's a guesstimate. Whenever you go in and do an experiment, already you have in your mind, this is the way it's gonna be. And at the end of the day, it turns out that's not the way it is, but what you had was a guesstimate. So today you're going to make a guesstimate. Make a number in your head. Give it to me. What is the first number that comes to your mind? Okay. You're all very, very wrong, so you will not get it. Neither will you, although I promised you 12 bananas. We'll deal with that later on. Just come and see me. The rate is 1. The Dutch export is twice as valuable as the Indian export. As a matter of fact, the Dutch export is the second largest behind the United States in value, which is totally crazy. It's nuts. And we don't export nuts, but what is being exported are high valuable seeds that are, among others, sold to India, because you get a unique quality of these seeds. And some of these seeds, tomato seeds, are a kilogram as much as gold. Why? Because they're all the same. Every time you get the same. And what I'm trying to say here, those of you, as probably most of you material scientists, you have a responsibility, because in order to achieve that, there's a lot of material science going on behind that. You want to do it efficiently. meaning that you need to have energy storage, you have to have energy conversion, you need to have water purification, and all of this is material science. So material science and agricultural sciences are very much integrated in each other. Now, having said that, this is actually probably more the ratio that it should be, but you know, we are not modest from the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, I probably should say I'm not really from the Netherlands. I'm actually from a different kingdom, small one called Denmark, which is the same size of the Netherlands. Their export value is not as big, so I'll not be bragging about that. And the population is only 1/3, so it's even more vacant, actually more empty than the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, the Dutch farmers go to Denmark and do very well there because the Dutch don't want to, sorry, the Danes don't want to become farmers. Anyway, 40% of the Netherlands is made by man. And why is that important? That means that from 1,000 years ago, people had to collaborate in order to make new land for themselves. So this collaboration and trust in each other, the fact that you're willing to pay your taxes and you think that you get something back for the taxes, you might not personally get it back, but you actually get it back as a community, is a very, very important part. Trust in each other. I'm not saying that I want you to sort of fully believe in that, but if the government trusts you and you trust the government, then you get a long way in collaborating, and you can actually end up making 40% of the land mass being actually gained from the sea. As a matter of fact, today, still 30% of the Netherlands is below sea level. So when you land in Schiphol, which is the Amsterdam airport, but we don't call it that, we call it Schiphol. No, it's difficult to pronounce. You land about 6 meters under sea level. So if it so happens on the way there that the dikes would break, you would be landing in the sea. Mind you, if you have the opportunity, go on the upper level in the plane then, yeah? Why do I say this? That means that when we are talking about climate change, we're talking about energy, we're talking about sea level rising. If we by 2100 have a 1.5 degrees sea rise, sorry, 1.5 degree temperature increase, the sea level will change probably about 30 centimeters of the estimates these days. Of course, that depends on how much is actually melting. Not so much from the North Pole, because that's already in the sea, but actually from the South Pole and from Greenland. And the estimate now is 30 centimeters, but it may very well be 50 centimeters by 2100. That means that you as scientists have a great responsibility in contributing to making sure that it doesn't exceed that. You being the young people, most of you, you're the future, and the investment, not just from India, but for the world, to make sure that these things do well tonight. But nevertheless, the responsibility is very big. Now, so who determines what we do research? Well, I just had the opportunity this morning to talk to the head of physics, and we talked about who pays the research. And well, I typically say, well, we do whatever research the research grant organizations will pay us to do. And that's basically the bottom line. And in this particular case, this person is from NIH, and that's actually an American organization, National Institute of Health. And they do mostly in bioscience. And he says, you're completely free to carry out whatever research you want, so long as you get to these conclusions. That's, of course, just a joke. They will never do that. They will tell you, this is the area that we want. But they will tell the people applying for the research grant, this is the kind of research we expect you to do. And once again, like your guesstimate, it might be ending up in a totally different place where you started out. But at the end of the day, you hope you get some interesting results that if it cannot be used to what you initially thought, at least it can be used for something else. Now, how to publish in a scientific journal? Well, what steps do I need to take to get a manuscript before I write the manuscript? What type of manuscript we have? How can I ensure I'm using the proper manuscript language? Mind you, I say manuscript language. I don't say language. I don't say English. I don't say that, you all have to use proper English. No, I'm saying proper manuscript language, meaning you have to look at the kind of journal you're going to submit it to and look what is the terminology that you use there. If you come from chemical engineering, you'll have a certain terminology for certain things that the chemist would slightly call different things. Mind you, you have to know the terminology. How do you know the terminology? Well, like you need to crawl before you can walk. That also applies to writing a paper. You have to read papers before you actually write a paper. So if someone tells me, yeah, I don't need any references because I have not read any papers anyway, I'm telling you, well, that's nice. You go back and you read some papers and then find out, because most likely what you think that was all novel and new had been done many, many times over. I know some people take pictures. You're only welcome to take pictures as long as I'm not in the picture, because they do see my profile. No, but you will get a PDF file of it. All the you will not get the cartoon. I don't own that. I own this. My idea. I'm the only one who ever owned it. No, many of these things you can find on the internet anyway. But you will get a PDF. I will send it through probably Dr. Trey and make sure that you can gain access to it. Yeah? Don't tell anyone else about it, otherwise I have no one else to visit. How do I structure my article properly? We'll talk about that. What is the process and what is the article construction? We want to publish a paper. Here you are. This is late at night. Been working hard. You have two very nasty looking things there in the background. I'm more of a physicist. Whenever I see bottles like that, I tend to run out of that. And if I meet this guy, I would probably run out too. Well, first thing on the checklist, we need some content. We need some results. You cannot write a paper and initiate a paper before you have any results at all. I know when you submit, and the professors here in the room will agree to that, you submit a proposal, you've written an abstract, you've written a proposal. At the end of the day, when your PhD is done, you probably will end up in a totally different place. And it's just like a road you don't know. And every time there will be, you will hate your advisor. You want to kill him or her, strangle them, preferably stuff that stupid paper into their mouth. It's fully normal. And I know some of you are laughing. That's probably because you're not in the position at this moment. But trust me, my PhD students, they probably had small dolls at home where they put needles in because they hated me so much. Someone still, they have not quite forgiven me yet, but we're working on it. Anyway, so we assume you have some interesting and novel results. Check with your colleagues, check with your advisors whether it is really novel. And last but not least, and once again, check the literature. Go in, use one of these search engines to find whether other people have already done that. You will be surprised that many of the things that you think of very, very unique and nobody has ever thought of it, there's probably someone out there who's done that. Learn from that. Don't cry. Grow up. Now, the first thing of publishing a paper is always, once you have the content, let's be clear about that. You have the content. You know what your results are, and we'll go back to how to build up your manuscripts later on. But you have the content. You have to look at a journal, and every single journal has what is called an aims and scope. It will be published on the website, the homepage of a journal. Every single reputable journal has a homepage with the aims and scope. It might be called something differently, but that's what it is. In this description, it will talk about the subject they want to have. Typically, the subjects you can actually publish in that. They'll talk about the audience that they tend to try to reach. They'll talk about the type of articles. We'll get onto that later on. What type of articles do we have? because there are many sorts, many flavors. And then there is something what I would call the quality. We'll talk about that later on. The coverage of the field, and possibly it might be associated with a group, that would be like the American Chemical Society Journal. They're associated obviously with the American Chemical Society. Does that mean that you have to be a member of that society to submit your paper? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that whatever money they make from making the journal will be going partly into the American Chemical Society. So when you pay, if you pay for it or you pay your subscription to that, then you're partly also paying for American Chemical Society's work. Who are the stakeholders in this? Do you know the term stakeholders? Is that used in India? Those are the people who have some kind of what we call vested interest in you publishing. There are many of them. There is obviously the funding agency, the academic institution, the authors and co-authors, the publisher. The publisher can be a person, or it can be actually the publishing house. They're obviously interested in getting, they all want your content. They all want your papers. They may not necessarily want it in that journal, but it could be in some other journal. But they want your content. They all want it. And they don't want you to go to the competitor. Because if you go to the competitor, they will not have the content. The editor, the reviewers, the libraries, and the readers. Today, I'll be focusing on mainly the authors and the co-authors, and I will talk about a little bit about the reviewers. And the point is that you're an author, but you also have to be a reviewer. You should not never always believe everything you see in the screen. It could be I can just click here and it disappears, right? Here's the warning. And that all applies to papers. Sorry, guys. I couldn't help it. Because I actually thought this was going to be the second presentation of today. So then the people who had been attending the first presentation would say, oh shit, his battery is not lasting long enough. Don't worry. You know, material science also goes into batteries. And my battery is made by some brilliant people, probably in China or in India, from Macintosh. Don't worry. It lasted more than 5 hours at IIT. I made the same joke there. They all jumped up and wanted to feed my computer with current. Well, don't worry. We'll get there. Don't always trust what you hear. What I tell you today, except for now, I'll not make any cruel jokes like that again. It's very important. Not always trust it. But you like to put numbers in. Love that. And when we talk about the authors, we can talk about how many papers have you published. If you don't know that, then you have a problem. How many numbers are cited? That's not the only number you need to know about an author. The number of high-impact papers and the number of papers in high-impact journals that might sound like the same thing, it's not. Mind you, you can have a paper in a high-impact journal that is a paper in a high-impact journal, but nobody cares. You can also have a paper in a less high-impact journal that a lot of people will read and a lot of people will cite. The best of all would probably be to have a very high-impact paper in a very high-impact journal. As I'll show you in a second, the chance of that is next to nothing. Now, the journal itself, you can talk about the number of published papers, the size of the journal, the acceptance rate, also very important. I'll show you our acceptance rate, not something I'm very proud of. It's very, very low. The so-called impact factor. Sorry. No, if you say something, you have to say it out loud.
When you talk about
I will show you that it's almost nothing. Okay, and we are working on getting zero. I'm not that wrong. So you're not that wrong, but you're getting there. So you probably will have to share the bananas, the two of you. Impact factor and what is called the eigenfactor. I will talk a little bit about some of the things. I'll definitely get back to the acceptance rate. If I forget, you'll remind me. Please do that afterwards, otherwise this presentation will last too long. No, we'll get there, don't worry. Readers, average time spent. You will be surprised when you actually look on a web page, because we all do that. We don't go into the library anymore and look at these books. No, I'm so old that back then there was nothing electronic, nothing. You couldn't even send your paper by mail. By email to your. We did have email, but that was pretty much only in my last year second to last year as a PhD student. We got emails. Yeah, I'm that old. You cannot submit your paper by any electronic means. You have to actually have your paper typewritten by the secretary. We had a rather, let's say, old secretary, and she was very tough. So you wrote a paper, and she used it on the type machine, and then you found a mistake in what you had written, and you had to go in to tell her that she had to rewrite that. She would stare at you for about 5 minutes, and you're like, well, I could also type it myself. You don't know how to use a typewriter. You go back, I will do it, but you're in the doghouse. Anyway, areas of interest. So the average time you spend on reading a paper is very important. Why? You read the papers, and then of course it also means how many downloads does a paper get? And of course also how many citations does a paper get? You'll be surprised that actually some papers are being read a lot, downloaded a lot, but not cited very much. That means that the people who wrote that paper, and we'll get back to that you can actually write a very interesting title, very good abstract, and at the end of the day, the results that you actually show are not all that interesting, so people don't cite your paper. So the real trick is to write something where you have a good title, good abstract, and preferably also some good results that people want to cite. Why? Because if people don't read your paper, you don't exist. If people don't cite your paper, you don't exist as a scientist. You have no impact on society. Ultimately, I know you're writing your papers to your colleagues, but hopefully one of them will use the very fundamental things that you have found to something very, very useful that could help, in your case, most likely, the Indian society, but as a whole world. Who does not know what an H-index is? You all know? Okay, we'll skip. Oh, good. Thank you. One person. Thank you. H-index was, of course, defined by a physicist. His name is Jürgen H. And he was very modest, like all physicists are. He called it H-index because, Hirsch H-index. Now, that means if you only have one publication, and will remain one. And if you have two papers, if the second one doesn't get any citations, it's still one, and so on. So if someone has an H-index, say, I'm probably offending one of the old professors here, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. And most people with high H-index only have that because they have written a lot of papers and had other people write their papers as well. Now, that was one of the indices. But once again, I warn you, the H-index is not the only thing. These two professors here, or these two professors, might be equally tall, but we're not going to say, even though they're equally tall, they're one and the same person. There are many other dimensions to a person's oeuvre, as you call it, what they have done. So don't just look at the H-index of someone and saying, this is what determines what this person is doing. I know when universities are hiring faculty, they're looking at the H-index. I urge them being the universities, to look at more than one dimension, but also looking into what kind of papers have they written. Is people relevant for what we want to do in our department, what have you. I know people who are going to academia that's very tough and it takes a lot of time and effort. Trust me, at the end of the day, you'll be better off getting people in the field that you think would be best suitable for your department, that complement the research you have or the research you aspire to have in your department. It's very, very important. That's not so much for you PhD students, but one day you will be in the same position. Now, journal impact factor is another very important, and that's not about the author, but that's about the journals. Impact factor is owned, is registered trademark of a company called Clarivate. Clarivate makes a product called Web of Science, which is a database of scientific literature. I don't know whether you have access to Web of Science here at the university, but Web of Science is one of the databases. The other big database is now made by Elsevier. It's called Scopus. But whenever you see journal impact factor, it has to be journal impact factor made by Clarivate. Any other impact factor is well, okay, I have to be very careful here. In India, I know about talking about bullshit because that is really holy, but that's not really. It's called BS. It's not true. It doesn't exist. What is the journal impact factor? It is the number of it's the number of citations in a year. Oh, I was too long to come on. It's the number of citations in the 2 years prior to, sorry, it's the number of citations to papers 2 years prior in the previous 2 years to a given year. So in 2017, you take all the citations to all the papers 2015 and 16, and you divide that by the number of publications. That is the journal impact factor. The journal impact factor is published the year after in June. So it will be in 2018, the 2017 impact factor was published. So if someone wants to have the journal impact factor of a journal for 2023, they'll have to wait until June of this year. So that will relate to the number of citations in 2021 and 2022, all the publications in 2021 and 2022. So it's running behind, and that also means that you cannot have a you cannot have an impact factor until after 3 years. So any new journal will not have an impact factor. Journal impact factor is a ratio between two numbers. It's not necessarily a quality factor. It's not necessarily related to the quality of content or the quality of peer review. It's merely a ratio between the number of publications and the number of citations. That also means that review journals, and review journals are journals that are only publishing review papers, and review papers are typically written by well-established professors in the field, and they've been doing this for many years, and now they're writing all about what they have done and other people have done in this, and they're very important, very interesting to read, and therefore also very interesting to cite. Review journals tend to have typically higher impact factors. It's also very dependent on in what field you are. For instance, in mathematics, typically they don't cite many other papers. So if you have typically in a field that you always cite 30 other papers, and you have another field where they typically only cite 2 other papers, obviously that also means that the impact factor in that area will on average be a little lower. Why? Because they only cite 2 other papers or 3 other papers. And if they only cite their own papers, which would be absolutely not done in our field, then these impact factors are really not very meaningful. So I want to warn you that within a given field, you might be able to compare two journals and their impact factor, but it's just one number, just like the H index. It's not the whole story about the journal itself. As a matter of fact, and we'll get back to that, when you're about to write a paper, make sure you have all the relevant references related to that paper, collect them, make the reference list. Don't necessarily put them in the place where you want them, but make the reference list. Look through that reference list. And if you have a given journal that you have referred a lot to, and these references are relevant, that's also very important, then that might be the journal you should submit your paper to. But do not turn it around. Do not say, I want to get into journal X, and therefore I need to have a lot of references to that journal, because then they'll accept my paper. That's not the way it works. First, write the paper, make the references, and then you can go on. Obviously, self-citations and purposefully addition of the same journal article can change your you can make a lot of self-citation, and that's probably not a very good idea, and you probably will get in trouble. And it might actually make sure that the publisher will not even consider your paper. Yes, a question. No. You can only ask one question. Yes, go ahead.
If you want to say that you have established some work already, you want to cite your paper.
Yeah.
I guess suppose if I don't cite, you may also think I'm hiding.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. Let's see if I can find the small gift I wanted to give you. No, I cannot. It's actually so small I lost it. No, I found it. I see something blinking down here. Anyway, you get actually a wooden shoe. Well, you can't fit it, but anyway, yes, that's a very good question. Yes, you need to cite all the relevant papers. And if one of those papers or two of those papers tend to be your own work, you need to cite it. And if you do not cite it, and it should have been cited, then the editor will be a little suspicious. Not a little suspicious, he will be very, or she will be very suspicious. And you might end up having your paper accepted because you're hiding your paper, as you said. Don't do that. And especially also because it could lack novelty if you don't show the relevant publications. You had a second question?
Suppose if we already established some facts and we are now next work is based on the
Yeah.
Yes.
But once again, if it's a small incremental step, then probably the paper will not be acceptable. Yeah. I will strongly recommend whenever you have something that is obviously the obvious next step, and you have pretty much already done it, but you decide, well, you know, my PhD student needs 3 papers in order to graduate. I don't know whether you have these rules here. Probably do. Only 1 paper. Ah, that's good. Because if you split up a good work into 2 different pieces, you do what is called salami publishing. If you don't know what a salami is, that's a Italian sausage, and you can cut that into small pieces, very thin sliced. And that means that you have 2 papers that are not extremely good, any or one of them, and therefore probably none of them will be cited very well, which is not a good idea. Yeah, so don't do that. Yes, just a second. I need to give someone who got it so terribly wrong, but still yes, and I will put you on the spot now. I'm sorry, how many? 2.72%. If you ask me a stupid question, you'll get a stupid answer. Okay, if someone has a percentage, then I'll say stupid journal. The simple reason is that you need to cite the relevant papers. And if you have 2 papers, or maybe 3 papers that are relevant, and you only have in total 20 papers you need to cite, that might exceed their percentage. In our case, we will look and make sure that the citations you give are relevant. So I don't want to offend you when I say a stupid question gets a stupid answer, but I think stupid numbers not like that. That also applies, by the way, to things like authenticate, or maybe you've heard the term turnitin.com, Turnitin, which is often used by universities. I wouldn't be surprised if you also use it here. Yeah, because we like to put the papers through the engine of that, and then look to see whether the student has been cheating us. And then it will say, oh, if it's 17%, then it's bad. No, because 17%, when you're talking about a method to measure something, is not 17% of your conclusions. Meaning that some parts of a paper is more easily copied and the same as another paper. Okay, so once again, just like the H index, just like the journal impact factor, overlap in various parts is not the same percentage and doesn't have as much as an impact of your evaluation. Yeah. So all these things, yes. Just warn you, 5 hours will. Didn't you listen to what I just said? Stupid questions get stupid. No, it all depends. If you are talking about, say, using TEM, I don't know whether that's in your field, but let's say, then there's only so many ways to explain how TEM works. And I don't expect you to try to invent new words to describe that, because nobody will understand it then. So if the overlap is that part, everybody will say, yeah, okay, of course it is. Maybe you didn't need to repeat it. You might as even have said, well, you know, everybody knows using TM, you can look in the literature and this is how it's done. Yeah? Is that in our journal you're talking about? So other journals, okay. Just send me the names of those journals, I'll talk to them. No, the point is, every single journal has their own way of doing this. All I'm saying is that our intention, and if you, for some reason or other, feel that you've been unfairly treated by the editor, you can always complain to the editor-in-chief. You might not get the editor-in-chief to agree with you. Some of you know of that. But nevertheless, you always have that opportunity. And if someone says you have 15% overall similarity index and we don't accept that, to be honest with you, I find that ridiculous. I mean, okay, 15% is a little bit high. Having said that, because 15% means that 15% of your text is very, very, very much similar. But I have a totally different presentation on some of these, because some of these are actually based on AI. And there is a specific algorithm how they do that. And that algorithm is actually relatively non-transparent, because it's not that simple to say that it's 15%. So I don't want to go into that too deep into that. But bottom line is, and take that home, and that applies to you as well, exact percentages is really not easy to give. The percentage, depending on where it is in your paper, is very important. If you have, say, 15% overall because your abstract is 15% of your paper, and that is exactly the same of an abstract of a different journal of paper, then you're in trouble. Yeah. Rule of thumb in our case is that anything where the overall percentage of overlap is 25%, then they really have to zoom in and find out where it is. And our journal, being a very big journal, I'll tell you later on how big it is. We have 42 people, 42 editors. Okay, so I'm the editor-in-chief, and I have 42 people, of which I sent them all an email last night that I communicate with, and each one of them, then we'll have to go and look at these things, and well, the ones that have your paper assigned. So in our case, it's not that simple to have one sort of line, but we actually have a pre-screening before it's sent out to the rest of the editors. I mean, if I look like I have pain, it's partly because of your question, and part of the question is it sounds like a little bit like my dentist next door, but that's besides the point. That's a terrible question. No, it's a terribly good question, but it's also a terrible thing. That is that some reviewers, and this is not a reviewer workshop, you're authors, but the reviewers, they will ask you to cite their papers. If the paper is really indeed relevant, yes, it might be a good idea to do it. If it's not relevant, and if you personally find it's not relevant, as a matter of fact, in our case, we typically delete all the citations that they ask us to do, and we tell them that the reviewer has listed a number of his or her own papers, and that would reveal his or her identity, because we use what we call single blind review, meaning they know who you are, you do not know who they are, and we don't want them to force you to cite their papers, and we don't want them to tell you who they are, because then you might actually contact them and say, what the beep are you doing with my paper? So I would strongly recommend, if you disagree with that, in the, you know, these were really meant for the graduate students and not all these professor guys up here. So from now on, I will only give it to young people, and I'll determine who is young. You're a little too old. No. Sorry, guys. Don't take it too seriously, but take being an author very, very seriously. So don't accept that. Write in your cover letter, we'll get to that in a second. Also about how to write the cover letter and what you should do and what you shouldn't do in your cover letter. The cover letter is only read by the editor and not by the reviewers. So you can write anything you want to the editor in that cover letter. And hopefully the editor will take that serious and read that carefully. So if you're unhappy with something that the reviewer did, we'll get to that in a second, you can write that in your cover letter. Don't write that in the response to reviewers, but in the cover letter, if there's something you only want the editor to know. Now, the order of authors is, okay. No, we do not enforce anyone to have a specific order of authors. That's for every institute to decide themselves how they want to do that for each group. However, we expect that all authors on a paper have actually contributed to the paper, and if contacted by totally different question. Sorry, my excuse. That's what's called double-blind review. Are there journals that do that? There are very few of them. Actually, most of them that did it actually gave up on it. And they gave up on it for a number of reasons. One of them being that most of the reviewers would find out anyway. And secondly, also, and that may sound crazy, but we have a lot of people faking being from a given institute. We have people who claim, seriously, to be from MIT and Harvard. Yes. You know what the worst thing is? Dr. Shrey just stepped out. This person was employed by Elsevier. Nothing wrong with the paper, by the way. The paper was fine, solid, everything, except at the time when he wrote the paper with the other people, he was not the main author, not the last author, but he was one of the authors. He had no affiliation with Harvard. He had no affiliation with MIT. So that's what we call a bogus, false affiliation. You're an independent researcher at that point. We had no employment at a research institute. That's perfectly fine. You can submit a paper as an independent researcher. You can even give your home address, but you cannot pretend to be from an institute if the institute is not aware of you being from that institute. If you have an affiliation where you make no money, but you can still claim to be from that institution, that's perfectly fine. But if we ask the university or institute, do you know this person? Is this person any way, shape, and form associated with you? And they say, who? What? No, then we have a problem. So double blind, yes, that would be that you don't know the author, and the author doesn't know, and the reviewer doesn't know the author doesn't know the reviewer. There are no journals where the reviewer will not know the author and the author will know the reviewer. But there are many journals by now where not only will the reviewers be revealed, but actually the raw original reviews will be given as well. There are not many of them, but there are a few of them. We don't do that. I guess none of the Elsevier journals do that. We don't do that because people, when they write the review, we don't want them to be all too politically correct and don't try to be too fancy. First of all, because then we'll never find any reviewers. And secondly, also because it would take them too much time. Speaking of time, this might take a little bit longer than an hour, but just brace you. If you need to leave, please feel free. I will stop either when I'm done or when half of you are asleep. Whatever comes first. If all of you are asleep, I'll just sneak out. Anyway, you can have two different journals. One with an impact factor, say, of 3.1, and one of an impact factor of 38.1. One of them is called +1, PLOS1, and the other one is called Nature. Nature, everybody knows, Science and Nature are two very prestigious journals. But they have very, very, very different distributions of the citations. In Nature, there are many papers with a few citations, and then a few papers with a lot of citations. And they determine a lot what the journal impact factor is. So that means if you submit a paper to Nature, you have about a 1% chance of getting into Nature in the first place. And then you have a 1% chance of getting a highly cited paper in Nature. So when you're a PhD student and you want to have a highly cited paper in a high impact journal, Nature, your chance of getting in there and actually achieving that is 1 in 10,000. Okay? 1/100th of a percent of a percent, meaning you will never get it. I just want to mention that, so this single number, the journal impact factor, is an average, but the difference between the mean and the median, you know the difference, is very huge for Nature and is much less for +1. That also applies to Applied Surface Science and many journals, that their mean and median are very closely related. But in reality, you can go into these databases, you can find out yourself, because the journals themselves will not publish these numbers. But if you do that for Nature, this is the kind of picture you have, roughly speaking. This is actually from, I believe, 2016. Other bibliometrics figures, because as I said, journal impact factor is not the only one. As a matter of fact, Elsevier also makes a sort of journal impact. You give out these lists, but the list of journals is actually decreasing, and it's doing so for a number of reasons. One of them being that they find that some of the new journals are not good enough, not well established enough, and secondly, because it costs money to index these journals, and they don't want to, or they cannot spend that money to index these journals, because Clarivate is pretty much the only business they do is making this index. And they've been hurting. Why have they been hurting? For two reasons. One of them, you probably all know, it's called Google. because if we search by Google, we find all the journals we want. Or the other one is Scopus from Elsevier, which is a much bigger database by now, has a much more comprehensive way of searching. And although it's not the main business of Elsevier, it's a side business. It is still a business for Elsevier, and I think you have to pay for it. I don't know whether you have access to Scopus here. You also have it. Wow, you're a rich institute. You have and Web of Science and Scopus. Anyway, cited half-life time. That means that how many years does it take before a given paper doesn't have half the size? It depends on it depends on what kind of journal you have. A review journal will typically have a very long half-life time, meaning that people will keep reading that even though it's old. Many new journals, many of these applied journals like ours, they will have a shorter half-life time. That also means that your paper might be read for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but after that, people tend to say, oh, it's already 6 years old. It's been done 1,000 times now. We don't want to read it anymore. We don't want to cite it. So there also tells you a little bit about what kind of journal it is. If I get into this journal, how likely is it that people will keep reading this forever? Now, in this day and age, with us using computers to read things, well, the computer is not reading it, but it's helping us getting hold of it. It makes life a little bit different, meaning that we can choose what years we want to look into. If you go into Scopus, you can say, I only want to look from papers from 2017 and until today, or whatever you want. And as a matter of fact, in Scopus, there will be journal papers from the 1800s by now. Now, our journal, if anyone cites a paper before 1984, we have a big problem because it was founded in 1984. And as a matter of fact, in 1984, it was not even called Applied Surface Science. It was called Applications of Surface Science. So anyone who tries to cite a paper that is more than 40 years old will be bogus. Speaking of bogus, speaking of AI, we have talked about Google. How many of you have ever used AI? How many have never used AI here? I mean, I'm a very polite person typically, but can I say it just between the two of you? You're a liar. And I'll tell you why. Have you ever used Google? Yes, of course. So then you have used AI. When I say, have you used AI to scientists, they oh no, ChatGPT you mean? No, I didn't say that. I said, have you used AI? And you have. So I didn't mean it in a very negative way, but what I'm trying to say is that unknowingly, we have used AI a lot of times. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. We talked about references. Let's talk about ChatGPT or any of the other of these so-called generative AI programs. I have a whole long discussions about AI and publishing. I will not do that today. Don't worry. But one warning, don't ever ask ChatGPT to give you a reference. Do you know why? And if you tell me you know why, then you're a real liar, because then it means you've used it. But that's okay, we'll not ask you, but you know why. Why is that? It gives you fake citations. It will give you a citation that looks really darn good and very close to the reality. But it turns out it's the wrong author, the wrong page, but the right journal. Why is that? Why does a ChatGPT engine that you, by the way, do not pay for, how come you don't pay for ChatGPT? Do you know? You're training the engine. As a matter of fact, even worse, you are, if you had read the small print when you signed up, but trust me, you didn't. You just said, yeah, accept. You actually gave them permission to incorporate the information you gave to the engine. So if you take your brand new paper and you say, let's stop into ChatGPT. You have given away the paper and thereby implicitly given away the copyright to your paper to a company called OpenAI. Who owns OpenAI? Does anyone know? Nobody? One of the big owners is Microsoft. Elon Musk has, like in many other businesses, also a part of that, and a bunch of other rich Silicon Valley guys, but most of them from the US. So you give something away that is not yours to give away, probably, because your co-authors probably didn't know you did that. And secondly, what you get out of that, the references might be fake, and secondly, the language you get out of that, even though it does correct your English, it also reformulates your English, which probably, I assume, not even your mother tongue, but it will be, if it was anything, Indian English, more British English kind of English than North American English. So you get back something you didn't quite ask for. Two things. First of all, you gave away your thing that you couldn't give away, by the way. And secondly, you ended up with a more Americanized version of your paper. Last but not least, and that's another very important part of it, all of these have some ethical engines built into them. I'll not go into that, but we'll talk a little bit about publishing ethics later on. But this is a totally different story. That means that certain things it will not give you the right answer, or it will even refuse to give an answer. But typically, it'll give you an answer that is either avoiding the question or giving you a bogus answer. So just a warning. The side goal, that's once again, as I said, blah, blah, blah. Accept ratio, that is the ratio between number of accepted papers and received articles. You have to be very careful because there is a big discussion between Elsevier and yours truly, because Elsevier defines the accept ratio in a year as being the number of submitted articles in that year divided into the number of papers accepted in that year. That is not the accept ratio. The accept ratio is the number of papers being submitted in a year divided into the number of papers accepted out of those papers. So accept ratio for 2023 cannot be published in January of 2024. Why? Because many of the papers that were submitted in, say, December of 2023 will not be accepted until, say, May of 2024, or maybe be rejected by then. So there is a discrepancy. That means that for journals that grow very rapidly, it means like their accept ratio seems to be very low because they don't have too many accepted papers, and they have a lot of papers being submitted in a given year. You can imagine that there is a lag between the two of them. Elsevier insists on doing the other one because that's the easy thing, but I'm trying to convince them that doing the easy thing is not also doing the stupid thing, but that has not helped yet. Anyway, now we are in step 2, preparing the paper. Once you do that, you put yourself in the center of the world. I know the sun is not you, and you're not, all the planets are not evolving around you, but for the moment, you have to put yourself in the middle. You have 3 different entities you have to convince. First one, and most important in the first place, is the editor. Can you convince him or her to actually accept your paper into the review process? Once you've done that, then you have to convince the reviewer. And last, probably at the very end, you have to convince the reviewers the reader, not only to read your paper, but hopefully also to cite your paper. But you really have to think of those 3 entities. And the editor will not look at your paper very, very carefully. They will not read it very carefully. They will not go very much into the science. However, in our case, we have what we call topical editors. So if you're from India, you will not get an Indian editor. You'll get an editor who is supposedly in your field. And whether that person is based in Argentina or in North America or in Japan, doesn't matter. And if you at any point of time have the feeling that someone is biased against you, either because you're from India or you're from a certain religion or of a certain gender, please let the editor know. And if he or she says, no, that's bullshit, then you can always go to the publisher and they will have someone you can contact. We will not accept, and I repeat, we will not accept, and that is just not just my journal, any journal within Elsevier for that matter, any journal, any reputable publisher will accept any kind of bias against a certain group, a certain university, a certain ethnic minority, what have you. Nothing, nada. So if you ever have the impression, please let the editors know. However, you really have to justify it, because it could very well be that you feel unjustifiable, picked upon, but then hopefully it's based on the science that you sent, not your name, not your ethnic background, not whether you're male, female, clean, or whatever. That's what it is. What do we want? Bottom line, and you all know this, we want originality, significant advances in the field, clear context, blah, blah, blah. Standard. That's what we all want. How many types of papers will make a special issue? Mind you, if you submit to a special issue, that special issue is peer reviewed. It also means that you can't submit that paper again to a different normal journal and have it published there, because then you get into the percentages and then it will be almost 100%, and then you're in trouble. That you cannot do. But conference papers are very common. It's often used because you have a paper that you really want to pass, and conference proceedings, as they're called, typically have, for journals that do more than just that, have a slightly lower impact because the papers have often been rushed a little bit more, but that's just a general observation. We have something called short communications and short letters or letters. They're typically 3 to 4 pages. Most journals accept them. There are certain journals that only accept letters. One of them is called fixed letters. And they're typically meant to be short, not because you didn't want to write a full paper, no, but because it was so interesting and so novel that you couldn't wait for a full paper in order to let the rest of the world know about this. And at the same time, you implicitly promise to make a full paper later on. Don't go in Fish Rev Letters and read all the papers there and think that you can find the full paper somewhere else. Most of them forget that because they're on to much more interesting things in the meantime. But nevertheless, that's what they're intended to do. Then you have review papers, and they are typically only by invitation only. If you as a graduate student think you write a review paper, I have to point you. Review papers are basically reserved for people who have been in a field for a certain number of years, have contributed to the field themselves, and at this point is able to not only summarize what they have done themselves, but also what their colleagues in the same field have done. These review papers will either go into a journal, but there are also journals that only publishes review journals, and review papers, and these journals are often with a few papers per year. Some of them only about, say, 6, 7, 8 papers per year, but they're still big. So some of these review papers are hundreds of pages. That was not a question, right? It was just an itch. Perspective papers, they are often also by invitation only. Perspective papers is if there is an emergent field. Imagine now that you have made a device that can take directly solar energy and transform that into hydrogen, and the efficiency is something like 35% from beginning to end. Trust me, you'll never get to that point, but imagine. Then you can write a perspective article. You might not want to run it as just a short communication, but a perspective article is something that is emerging field and a breakthrough. Now, the general structure of a research paper, and now I'm talking about the building blocks of this, is the title, affiliation, abstract, keywords. Then we come to the introduction, methods, and discussion. And then last but not least, we have the conclusion, acknowledgement, and references and supporting materials. Supporting materials is becoming more and more important, meaning that many publishers now provide you an opportunity to give your raw data to a depository. As a matter of fact, some countries, in Europe, but also in other places in the world, are now requiring their researchers to deposit their raw data in what is called a frozen depository, meaning that you put it in and you can never retrieve it. Or you can retrieve it, but you can never change it. Okay? So it's like putting it in through a mailbox in the sense that you can get it out again, but you cannot put in a different piece of information. So that means that if you make something stupid in some of your data, it can always be retrieved. Or for that matter, in most places, they have to be publicly available. It's a totally different presentation that I may or may not give later on, which is about open science and open access. This is part of open science, meaning that typically many governments, and I know in India that most of the research here is paid by the government. The government says that if the research is done with our money, everybody needs to have access to it. Not just, you know, your colleagues at the other university, but as a matter of fact, anyone. I don't expect that your parents, if they're not scientists, to go in and check your data, but in principle, they should be able to. Having said that, that's one of the warnings in the open science part of it. There is a problem, especially in some of these more technology-driven research fields, because you don't want, for instance, companies go in and take your data and maybe making that into a proprietary product that could actually be licensed or in this case, copyrighted their company. Let's imagine that you've made a device, and based on the data you have, they know exactly how to do that. Based on that, they'll go in and make a copyright. Pharmaceutical companies are historically very good at doing this, meaning that what they do is they go in, because a lot of this NIH funded stuff has been forced to be open science, and the pharmaceutical companies have dived into these databases and found a lot of things that they could use. And what they do is they patent not just the way to do it, but also other alternative ways of getting to the final results, so that anyone who wants to make a generic drug, and as a matter of fact, just the other day I spoke to someone from FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in the US, who's actually based here in southern India. And she was actually looking at the clinical trials, but also at the generic drug production in India, because obviously we all want to have cheaper drugs, and India has a very large production of generic drugs and have some very good licenses for making drugs that are very, 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 very expensive in other countries. You're lucky enough that you've been able to force these companies to give it for less money. Now, this was the structure of the manuscript, but that's not the way you write it. The way you write it is like building a house. You need the foundation, and the foundation is really the figures, the table, your data. That's where it begins, the foundation of a house. You don't build a house by putting a roof out somewhere and then start putting windows underneath and then you do it. Well, there are crazy people who try that, but nevertheless, that's not the way we normally do it. And that's not the way you write a paper. You start with the figures, the tables, then you go to the methods, the results, the discussion, and ultimately you'll get to the conclusion and the introduction. And on the very, very top here, the roof is the title and the abstract. Do not turn this around. Do not start by saying, oh, I know what the title is going to be, blah, 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 blah. I wonder what I would put in that paper. That's not the way it works. Right? Get your results, decide, often not just alone, most often, with your advisor, with your colleagues. These are the results that we keep in the paper. And based on that, you will look at what kind of methods did I use to obtain those data. And what's the problem? It's cold. Well, we can cut off the electricity, except then you will have no presentation either. I'm insulated. And I'm from a different climate. Anyway, speaking of personal comfort, are you still comfortable with this? This is the build-up. Start with the fundamentals of that. Don't include methods in your description that you have not obtained data from. So if you say that you've used XRD, which is a method, X-ray diffraction, and you don't show the results, don't put that in your paper. If you say I've used TEM, SEM, show SEM, don't write about TEM, SEM and not TEM, two different methods. Now, speaking of methods, as a PhD student, and you're about to kill your advisor, I promise, go to the website called PhDcomments.com. It will bring you some relief. Not all of it, but some relief. And in this particular case, this female graduate student says to her advisor, he says, about your last drafts, Jill, yes, it's too short. Too short? But last week you said it was too long. Did you even read it? No, as a matter of fact, I only read the second to last draft as a way to do it. That's pretty much how you're going to feel about your advisor. He or she might not have read it very carefully. That's true. Hopefully, he or she will read not second to last, but versions before that. But make sure whenever you write something, you actually talk about it before you write it. So check the submission as thoroughly as possible before submission. Ask colleagues and supervisors to review your manuscript. And when I say that, ask your colleague PhD student, and for that matter, if you really want the honest opinion, if you have an ex-boyfriend or if you have an ex-girlfriend who's also a scientist in a similar field, ask them to do it. They'll give you a more than honest reply. And you read that. Because the same person will be the kind of review you will end up getting. You need to be able to take the heat. You need to be able to deal with the adversity of being criticized for what you've done. Even though you think that everything is perfect, chances are that there are issues in the paper that should have been addressed and will be addressed probably before it gets accepted. And now at this point, finally you submit your manuscript with a proper cover letter and await a response. Now I know here you have Gandhi, who has said many wise things, and there was a fellow named Martin Luther King in the United States who was very much in the same trend, besides the fact that they were both spiritual persons, different religions. But Martin Luther King, who was actually a doctor, Martin Luther King Jr., he said, the arch of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a little bit convoluted probably. Or what it really means is that, you know, it might be very tough road, but eventually, hopefully, it will come well. So remember also, try to be as correct as possible and polite in your correspondence with editors, reviewers, and for that matter, your colleagues. Don't try to use offensive language, because don't do to others what you don't expect them to do to you. And so whenever you have a reviewer that you really think is a total, put it very bluntly, a total jerk, be polite. And we'll get to that now. So the waiting game after the submission. Generally, editors first check the topic, the language, and the completeness, and they're actually allowed to desk reject your paper. Typically because the paper is out of scope, sometimes because there are fundamental errors in your paper, or what have you. But you should get some explanation why it was done. After initial check, they will send it out for review, usually to a few reviewers. We typically try to get at least 2. How many do we need to invite to do so? It's a good question. We need to, on average now, to invite 9 reviewers in order to get 2 full reviews back. which is terrible. Why is that? Well, that's because other researchers are very busy and nobody gives them, in their opinion, recognition for the fact that they are actually reviewing the paper. So since they don't feel that they get the recognition, some will do that only if you cite the papers. That's not good. Because if you write a paper, and you will see in a second that the ratio between the number of accepted papers and submitted papers is about 5-1. It also means that you probably will have to review, because we need at least two reviewers. It means that you have to review probably 5 papers for every papers you write. I'm not going to ask all the senior people here whether they have last year reviewed 5 times as many papers as they have written with their group, but that is actually the number you need to. We tend to not try to overburden our reviewers, and that means that we don't want to, well, it used to be that we only invite them once a year. That's impossible these days. Yes.
I have a good experience
Yes. Because you gave us a compliment, I'll give you a wooden shoe. You didn't already get, oh, you already get, no, it's not a shoe. No. Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we've been working on. And when I say we, I don't want to take full responsibility for that, but it's part of what I've been working on, which has been very appreciated by the community, and especially very appreciated by Elsevier. But there's a downside to that. That is that we have a lot of authors that now find that Elsevier is the best journal to submit your work to, because within a week you will know whether the paper is actually pretty good. And that means that a lot of people are sending papers that are not pretty good. No, seriously. And they say, and they're very honest about it, they said, if you ask them, and they will say, well, we submitted to you because you have the reputation to be very fast at your decision. And by doing so, we didn't expect to get into your journal, by the way, but we can use that to make our paper better. And then, you can use different words of being a little angry. Let me put it this way, I got very disappointed, meaning that we do the work and someone else publishes them. No, I mean, yeah, but it's no laughing matter, I can tell you, because we put a lot of money, I mean, it's not my money, but there's a lot of effort, a lot of manpower being put in there. And
after 6 weeks, reminder, they say it's not suitable for the journal after 6 weeks. So whether I should be angry or whether I should be sad, you tell me what I do. One of the top journals in the internet.
Not applied service science. So it's a much better journal than applied service science, apparently. There are no better journals than personal science. So I want my wooden shoe back. Okay. Give me the name and numbers. What's that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's indeed a very good journal. 6 weeks. Yeah. But I told you the arch, and my mother would say, all good things take time to come. But of course, when you get a rejection after 6 weeks, that's probably not what you wanted. But you have to realize that if you send it out, and when I say rejection, if it is a desk rejection after 6 weeks, that's a pity, because that shouldn't necessarily be taking 6 weeks. However, we've been blessed that Elsevier has been able and willing to support us. And I must say, we are probably the only journal, because we actually one of the so-called mega journals. There's only a handful of mega journals within Elsevier, meaning that their journals are about 20,000 submissions. There are some that have about 32,000, but we have 20,000. And we are considered to be mega journals. And there's about 6 or 7 of us. And we are each unique in our own field, but typically they tend to some way or another get relatively good support in terms of amount of resources we can use in order to process all these. And we've been very fortunate also because we've done it in what I consider to be a very efficient 2-tier model, where we have the pre-screening that is fast, and then we go on to the topical editors. So the topical editors, because we have 32 of them, they would be overloaded because then they would average have 600 papers. That would be about 2 a day almost, which is way too much for any scientist to deal with, to actually fully do all this job. Because typically an editor will spend about an hour to an hour and a half for doing a paper from the beginning to the end. So that would mean that they would have to take out 600 hours of their life. And for those of you, I don't know how many hours you work per year, but in Europe, it's most often 1,852 to be exact. Now that's in the Netherlands. It used to be 1,852 hours you work a year. That would be 1/3 of a man year you have to dedicate for something. And yet the editors get a small compensation. But trust me, it's peanuts compared to what they make as a professor. So they do it basically for nothing. And so these professors do it because they find themselves that if they didn't do it, someone else had to do it. Of course, many people also find it a great honor, and it's also honorable. And there is a recognition associated with that. And sometimes, like I do as an editor-in-chief, I get the opportunity to go here. So I would like to emphasize, I went here on my own. I didn't get invited by the university here. I didn't get told by Elsevier to go here. I decided to go to this particular place, partly because I had some relationship with some of you, but partly because I wanted to go to this place. I'm going on to Chennai, partly because I wanted to go to IIT Chennai, Madras, sorry. And partly because that's where the headquarters is of Elsevier. Elsevier's headquarters, India, I should say, but is also the nerve center for everything that goes on in the publication of all Elsevier journals. When I joined Elsevier, and as it was said, don't say that, they had a high-rise in Amsterdam. It was called the Elsevier headquarters Amsterdam. They had 2 headquarters, one in England, Oxford, and one in Amsterdam. It was a high-rise of 24 floors, still 24 floors. The building is no longer owned by Relics Elsevier, because Elsevier is part of a bigger company called Relics. They only have 3 of those 24 floors left. Partly because they've been downsizing, so fewer people working for each journal, so everybody needs to work harder. And secondly, because a lot of this work has been transported, outsourced to India. So whereas India used to be next to nothing in terms of size, now it's probably 1,000 more people working in Chennai. I know for those of you who are involved in the financials of this, that doesn't seem to be reflected in the subscription prices. And that is partly because people pretty much publish about 5 times as many papers as they did 20 years ago per one. Anyway, they receive the editor, the reviewer reports. It takes many weeks because many reviewers decline it, unfortunately. So expect it to take somewhere between 8 to 10 weeks if your paper goes out to review. It takes 8 to 10 weeks before you get back 2 reviews as an editor. If you get back 2 reviews that both have the same opinion about a suggestion for the review, for the paper, as well as you find that both reviews are complete, meaning that they really contain some information, then as an editor, you will look through. You might edit some of that if you don't like that they have actually added some of their own publications. They have the authority to do so. They also have the authority to disregard reviews if they find them either offensive, not to the point, or just plain rubbish. But if they have someone who says accept and the other one says reject, and they both look equally important and very good, then you have to invite the third one. And then at that point, you would be, curious, what is going on with I heard that my paper had sufficient review, and now all of a sudden I don't get anything. Well, that's because the editor decided that I'm not happy with the reviews. I'm not happy that they disagree among them, and I don't want to make the decision based on those two reviews. So don't at that point force the reviewer, make a decision, stupid editor, because then he or she will say reject. Trust me. They'll go for the worst suggestion then. Editor will ultimately inform the author. I don't think this works. It works? Okay, so they will inform the author. What's that? Food, yeah. Birdie. No, it's a terrible. It's actually from a movie. Birdie Nam Nam from Peter Sellers, who is a British actor, and he plays an Indian. It was terrible. Today, these days, it would be so unethical to make this movie, but it's funny nevertheless. He's playing the struggling Indian actor, and he ends up blowing up the whole set of the movie. And the movie director wants to kill him, very much like you want to kill your supervisor. Editor will inform the author. Who is the editor going to inform? Who is the editor going to inform? Not the big professor, unless he or she was the one who submitted the paper. The editor and the journal only communicates with one person. That is the submitting, or we call it the corresponding author. That doesn't necessarily have to be the corresponding author that is ultimately on the paper saying corresponding author. You can have more than one, but it doesn't have to be the same person. It can be a different person. And we would typically prefer that the corresponding author at the very end is someone who will remain in the system, or at least you can reach them. So using a Gmail account or using any other Hotmail or what have you is fine with us. You don't have to use your institute email address. Why? We much rather want that we can reach out, not just us, but more importantly, other authors of other papers can reach out to you and ask you questions if they have any questions. So make sure that the corresponding author will have the email address for quite a while. And if not, make sure that you know what their new email address is if someone else contacts you. Reviewers, and for that matter, editors, have various tools, as I talked about, the Authenticate. Obviously, as a reviewer, you also get access to all content published by Elsevier, and that means implicitly free access to the world's largest database, that is Scopus. And furthermore, we have what's called PSD referencing, or linking of all the various citations in the paper, meaning the reference list. Mind you, you want to read this down here? Then you'll need your glasses, and you can come here up and being an editor is also a human. All editors are humans. So whenever you submit a paper that is generated by ChatGPT, you're not going to talk to an AI engine that will say your paper is rejected. It is human work, and it's not all black and white. Here on the left, we have a black square with a gray square inside. On the right, we have a white square with a gray square in the middle. Are those two gray squares the same gray? No. A female. What do you think? And not the same. How about you? Not the same. Well, today you're in luck because actually now I changed one of them to be more gray. What do you think now? Still not the same. Okay, now you need to go to the optician. No, they are actually the same. Sometimes I'm tricky and then I actually change them. Today, I want it to be nice. And apparently you don't trust me. I don't blame you at this point, but trust me, they are the same. They are the same gray. However, once in a while, when you wake up in the morning, you feel like white, and the next day you feel like black. That applies to editors. So if you happen to get an editor at Friday at 7:00 p.m. that has had a tough week, he or she will think, ah. Monday morning, he or she might think differently, meaning that decisions are human, and it's perfectly okay to question the. So now I change them around again. Once again, they are the same, but there are basically three outcomes: accepted. If it gets accepted in a reputable journal and you had just submitted it, I know many of you probably don't drink, so don't do that. And many of you may not even be able to bake, so then you have to buy a cake because you need to give cake to all of your colleagues because they must have been suffering a lot because apparently your paper was so good, so you probably had a lot of help, and it got accepted directly. Chances of that, next to nothing. So trust me, in your career as a PhD student, and maybe even as a professor, you'll never have to buy cake for that. Most often it becomes a revision, major or minor. Minor revision means that the likelihood that it will get accepted is very, very high. Major revision means that the chances are smaller than with a minor revision, but the editor still believes that your paper can be transformed into a paper that would be published in the paper. Trust me, we all want your paper, but we only want a good paper. We don't want the paper that you just submitted because we can improve your paper so you can get a better paper and send it to another journal. That's not the way it works. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where we are often being used for that. If your paper gets rejected, and the probability is very high, 40 to 90%, don't look like this guy here, okay? Don't despair. It could be that the editor says, you know what? It's being rejected at this point because I don't see a path to having the paper accepted in any shape or form within a reasonable number of iterations. And typically, most journals will only accept 2, at the most 3. But I just looked at the numbers from last year. We had someone who actually had 7 revisions. That is extreme. Don't do that. Because then I would personally lose faith in that it would ever converge, we call it converging, to a paper that is acceptable. There are certain publishers, let's mention them, MDPI, have you ever heard of them? They will only do 1 revision. And then they'll accept your paper. I'm not saying it's a bad publisher. All I'm saying is they make life very easy for yourself, and they make life easy for themselves. Because they'll basically take your paper after 1 revision, and there is an editor that is actually employed by MDPI, not paid very well, who will accept your paper. So his job is reliant on that paper being accepted. Why? Because MDPI's business model is fully open access, and they only get money if their paper is accepted. Our editors are not employed by Elsevier, and they only want the best papers. I know Elsevier wants to publish them all, but that's none of our business, and we don't care about that. And that's probably the reason why MDPI journals typically have very high acceptance rates, and we don't. There's another reason for that. That is that if you know when you submit the paper that you have to pay $2,500 when the paper gets accepted, you make sure that the paper is darn good before you submit it. So you cannot compare the two acceptance rates and say, oh, the MPI journals are not very good because they accept anything. But it's true that the average papers they receive are probably on average better than ours. But at the same time, they also accept more things than we do not accept. There's another problem with MDPI, and I will not normally, I don't want to blame other other publishers. MDPI tend to ask you to include a lot of references to their own journals, which is absolutely unethical. We do not require you to include any references to applied surface science or for that matter, any other Elsevier journal, unless it is of importance to that. Having said that, if you have no references to any applied surface paper in your original submission, it probably means that applied surface science was never the journal it should have been submitted to. So it also works the other way around. As I said, when determining where to submit it to, look at the number of references to a given journal. If, I'm sorry it takes so long. Editor decision, revision, minor or major, meaning carefully study the reviewer's comments, adjust your manuscript, prepare a detailed letter response. Be kind, be nice. Once again, put any comment you have in the rebuttal and in the cover letter. Respond to all points, even if you disagree with the reviewer. You have to. Provide scientifically solid rebuttal. Do not ignore any of the comments. State specifically what changes you've made to address the reviewer's comments, and typically you will actually be asked to submit a manuscript, Word document, or whatever word processor you use that marks all the revisions you've made. So you have the marked and unmarked revised manuscript. If necessary, perform additional experiments, calculations, computations, if required, and these usually serve, obviously, to make the final paper stronger. I will briefly, and I'll go very, very quickly through this, also considering the time, but there's a lot of ethical issues you can do. You can have ethical issues regarding the authorship, omitting authors, adding an author that shouldn't have been there, deleting the authors after you submitted it, changing the author affiliation, changing the order of authors. That might not be an issue, but it could be a potential ethical issue because you, as a corresponding author, has the ability to change the order without the other authors knowing that. And whenever you do that, you do it on behalf of all the authors. And it's assumed from the journal point of view that everything you do is done not just from you, but from all authors. So when you submit a paper to our journal now, we typically require the co-authors to agree to the fact that the paper has been submitted to the journal. We do that for a number of reasons. First of all, we want to make sure that we know who the co-authors really are, because there's a lot of people who are willing to pay you good money for being a co-author on a paper that they contributed nothing to. And we want to be able to make sure that these people are for real, they actually exist. That also applies to the corresponding authors. You'll be surprised that we actually have authors that don't even exist that submit their papers. They don't exist. Why? Because the co-authors paid them to write a paper, but they already knew that the editor knew them personally and had banned them from submitting papers because they had done some bad things in the past. And then they just used a different name that has never appeared. Out of nothing, there's this author coming that has no profile, that has never written a paper before, and all of a sudden he or she is submitting a new paper that looks solid and scientifically sound. Typically, there are some fundamental problems. There's something called paper mills. Everything is bad. Corresponding authors, acknowledging contributors. Now, you can have unethical research methods, research standards violations, research data manipulation, omitting negative results, hidden research or instrument errors, and undisclosed conflicts of interest. Typically in material science, that's not often the case, but in some of these medical, biomedical things, there can be some of these conflicts of interest. Submission, multiple simultaneous submissions. Do not submit your paper to 2 different journals at the same time. Do not resubmit an already accepted paper. You will get banned and you will get in big trouble. Reusing parts of already accepted papers, that will lead probably to a big authenticate. Submitting under a false identity, similar to what I just talked about. Suggesting false or non-existing reviewers. An editor will ask you for typically 3 reviewers. And you probably might want to ask yourself, do they use all those 3 reviewers? The answer to that is no. Do they use any of them? They might not. Why do they then ask for 3 if you don't use them? Well, we ask that because we also want to make sure that you actually know the field yourself, and know who would potentially be able to review your paper. And who is a potential reviewer? Well, basically all of you would be that. But the professor who is well known, has published 100 papers, and has a group of 200 people, is not going to review your paper. So don't suggest this person. From your same own country, yes. Don't suggest your next door neighbor. Don't suggest someone you've been collaborating with recently. A past co-author, if it's more than 5 years ago, fine. And do not, and I repeat, do never ever try to reach out to someone who is a potential reviewer of your paper and say, if you receive my paper, you better hurry up with that review. Don't ever. Yeah, I know everybody is saying, no, we won't do that. Actually, I met someone, I'll not mention from what country, well, Romania. And she said, yeah, we had suggested three, now I even told you that the gender. I'll not tell you where she's from. Bucharest. Anyway, I'll not tell you her name. That I'll not do. Anyway, she said, yeah. I reached out to the 3 reviewers that I suggested and told them that if they get the paper, they should hurry up because I really need this for my research grant. That is absolutely unethical. This person had no clue that that was unethical. I'm like, are you nuts? That's totally unethical. Don't even think of it. Undisclosed conflict of interest. Once again, in summary, becoming an author of a reputable journal, create novel and interesting content, decide on the type of paper you want to write, find out if there are any requirements or suggestions from the institute. Some institutes, some universities, some funding agencies might suggest you only submit it to certain journals. I know that, for instance, the IITs of India are in top negotiations with Elsevier, and they're sort of at the brink of where they're going to tell Elsevier, we cannot afford buying your journals anymore, and we'll tell our authors, our researchers not to submit to your journal, to your journals. Tough thing to hear as a publisher. It's a tough thing for an editor. I have no influence on these negotiations. But at the same time, you have to realize there's a reason why it's becoming more expensive. Collect the references for the paper and look for likely links. Check the scope and the metrics for the potential journal. Finalize the paper in the appropriate format and style for the journal. Write a precisely formulated cover letter. Once again, nice and well formulated and to the point. And make sure you address it to the right journal for the right editor. And don't have all kinds of weird stuff in the cover letter that has nothing to do with your paper. Include valid suggestions for appropriate reviewers. Now, applied surface science has a side score of 12.1. The impact factor is actually has been going down, but I'll tell you in a second why that is. This is actually from last year. 2 weeks for time to first decision, so 1 week was very fast. 3.6 weeks for the review time, which is extremely fast. 1 week, once it's been accepted, it takes 1 week before it's been published. That means that the people in Chennai are working like nuts. As soon as your paper has been accepted, within 24 hours, it's actually already in production, meaning that there are people trying to type your paper, and they will ask you as quickly as possible to respond to any questions they have about that. Overall acceptance rate, determined as Elsevier does it, 18%. It's the #1 journal out of 21 in material science and coatings and films, just to Q1, whatever that means in most countries. Actually, in China, which is the Chinese Academy of Sciences, CAS, they have a much tougher, they only top 5%, and we actually in the top 5% now, but they also very quickly will remove you out of that top 5 if you, for some reason or another, do not accept that. Okay, we have 10 managing editors, and at the moment, we have 30 editors. We should have 32, but 2 have left us recently. These are the numbers. This is the number of submissions. In 2005, 2006, actually, we had 1,700 submissions. As you can see here, we had a big dip here. It's called COVID, or Corona. Why? Because we are an applied journal, meaning that people actually have to go into the lab. You have to at least be 2 people in most countries to be in a lab. 2 people could not be together. You cannot be in the lab. So the papers that we received there were actually old work that people were pulling out of their drawers, trying to pull out their hair, and how can we actually write papers? And then now we are recuperating, and we actually are up here at 20,000, except for 37. So had we had another 12 hours of 2023, we would have had passed the 20,000 line. Now you might want to ask yourself, so it increased with about 20%. Why did it increase? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. One of them being that in China now, the Chinese Academy of Sciences is asking people to submit fewer papers. They want fewer papers, but better papers. And that has slowed down the number of submissions from China. China is by far the largest contributor to us. Second largest is India, Korea, Iran, and a couple of other countries. They're all fighting sort of for the same position. I think in 2023, probably barely above South Korea. South Korea being, of course, smaller. Unfortunately, I have to admit, the acceptance rate for Indian papers is lower than that of South Korea. So when you look at the number of accepted papers from India in our journal, it's lower than that of South Korea. Is that because of any sort of bias towards Indian papers? The answer to that is no. But on average, the papers that we get here have more issues than we get from Korea. To be honest with you, and one of the reasons why I'm here is also because I want to encourage you to make sure that your paper is better when you submit it to our journal. Does this apply to all journals? No, it doesn't. One of the problems that we have is that we are very fast, and people tend to use our journal as the first journal to go to, and then eventually they will cascade down to a journal that is the right journal for their paper. The impact factor, as you can tell here, actually dropped down a little bit. That's not because our journal became poorer, or not even because of COVID or anything. It's actually because Clarivate changed the way they calculate it. And they were not very open about it. So many journals, the impact factor actually went down a little bit. And so I have to every time explain to people, yeah, well, don't blame me, blame Clarivate. As a matter of fact, if you look at the size score, typically, basically, pretty much the same thing, the average over 3 years, it actually increased. And as a matter of fact, size score is different than the journal impact factor, because journal impact factor is only being published once a year in June. The site score of 2023 is now being published every month, updated every month on the website, on Scopus. And so at a certain point, that will be finished and said, now that was the impact, the site score of 2023. But in the meantime, the acceptance rate is going down. Physicist, my background, I like to have everything in straight lines. So we are talking about acceptance rate and how we are trying to do anything about it. So if you take this straight line and you sort of extrapolate that, you'll see by 2026, 2027, don't even submit your paper because it will never be accepted anyway. 0. Well, luckily enough, this joke was much better a few years ago when we didn't have this plateau, but now actually it's plateauing out at about 18.7%. Not calculated the way Elsevier does it. So you don't see the numbers yet for 2023 here, because they are not known yet. I will only know that by roughly around June of 2024. Then I will know how many papers of the papers submitted in 2023 has been accepted from the submission in 2023. In June of this year, in Wuhan in China, close to Shanghai, there will be a conference on applied surface science, International Conference of Applied Surface Science. It's the 6th conference. It's the 3rd one in China, but we've had 3 more in, this will be the 3rd, 3 more in Europe. And the idea was actually we were supposed to go to the United States, but Elsevier, who's actually organizing that, we are facilitating the scientific program. Elsevier Conference Center, different company, is actually organizing this. But there will be a special issue published in Applied Surface Science, which is strange because we don't publish any special issues except for this one. So if you want to have special issues, you're going to go into this journal, which is called Applied Surface Science Advances. It's a spin-off of ours, and it only does thematic or special issues. So if you ever have a special issue you'd like to submit, it's in the field, and it looks like a reputable suggestion, then you can submit that to Applied Surface Science Advances. That's the spin-off of our, and all of this are journals that are in surface science. And as a matter of fact, among these, a couple of them are actually, and there's a few of them that are not on here, but Surface and Interfaces is also a spin-off originally from Applied Surface Science. And that means that they will not have the exact same scope as we do. Their scope is typically slightly different and a little bit broad. Yes? I'm sorry? Applied Surface Science Advances is a 100% open access journal. Yeah, so there is an APC there. Hopefully that's not necessarily the case. Okay, the problem is that many of these open access journals were created because there was a movement in Europe, especially called it was called Plan S, as a matter of fact. And I don't want to go into why it was called Plan S because actually pretty much nobody knows. I typically say that it's because it was short for a 4-letter word. That's besides the point. As a matter of fact, I know some of the people who were involved in that and what they did is, and you can read all about that, or I can actually give you a 2-hour presentation about open access and open science, and maybe I'll talk about it later. But I don't think I'll have time for that, how late it is already. They wanted to have only open access publications. And that was because they thought, well, the government pays for the science, so everybody should be able to read it. Unfortunately, publishing costs money. Either you pay it as a reader, or you pay it as an author. Ideally, and our journal is a hybrid journal, so you can choose to pay for it. And then you might ask, well, if I pay for it, is my chance of getting accepted in your journal higher? In our journal, as a matter of fact, even the editors do not know whether you have asked to have it open access or not. We treat them no different. There is absolutely no difference between how we treat a paper that is open access requested or non-open access requested. It does not matter for us. Why? We're not employed by Elsevier. We want to have the best science. We are scientists. We don't care about whether you pay for it or not. And look down upon, that's because many people think that if you go into an open access, you pay for having your paper published. Yes, you pay for it, but you don't pay necessarily for that it will be published no matter what. At this point, I'd like to thank you. And if there are any more questions left, I have a few more of the wooden shoes left. And then otherwise, I'll let you go. And he is turning off. And now, questions from the back row.
Does any of the publicity companies find out how many times the school paper has gone for that? The people are published out there, they keep on sending. Is there data available for that?
Let me see if I understand your question. Your question is whether the paper that has already been accepted in one publisher will be accepted also in another publisher? Well, if we find out about that, the paper will ultimately be retracted. But the accepted way of doing that is that all papers that have been submitted after the first accepted paper, not the first submitted paper, but the first accepted, will be retracted. And if the other publishers do not want to retract that paper, then if the first journal, the first publisher is a reputable publisher, they will retract it then anyway. We will not accept, and it's also a waste of your money as a reader, a waste of as an author if you go into open access, to have a paper twice published, because which one of them are you going to refer to then? Both of them or none of them? So we will retract it. And if a paper is getting retracted, back in the good old days when there were real papers on real paper, we had actually a librarian, a female, old at the institute. I got California Institute of Technology. She would actually go in and cut out the papers that have been retracted, because she would get every week or every month, I don't know, she would get a list of all the retracted papers. She would go in and cut them out, which she should never have done, by the way. She could have put cross around it or said retracted or whatever, but she didn't. As a matter of fact, sometimes she even cut out the first page of the next paper. Bottom line these days that your paper will never disappear, even if it's been retracted, except across it will be a big red sign saying retracted. That is the worst that can happen to you as a graduate student, for that matter also as a professor. And as a graduate student, if you want to pursue an academic career and you have just one retracted paper, forget it. You will not get a position. Big Ben has told us it's time to lunch. Any more questions? You never got a wooden shoe, right, James? You don't want one? Okay. No. I'll pay you some money to take back. No. But to answer your question, has it ever happened that someone has actually been in the system and changed something, looked at something? Yes. Don't tell anyone. And it was not an Elsevier employee, but someone had hacked into a Elsevier employee account by phishing this person's account details. And this person, which was traced, everything was traced, and actually accessed a lot of journals. And for a lot of journals, he or she, we don't know, has been paid apparently to help them get favorable final decisions. Luckily enough, in our case, he had not changed anything that was of any importance, but we had to go through like 35 pages and make sure that everything that was in there, because we can see the raw reviews, we can see everything, and trace it back. Nothing changed to see how it went on in there. So either our journal was not important enough for him, or he realized by screwing around in our system that he would make himself visible. So yes, it has happened. Does it happen? This is the only case I know of, and in many years, and it's actually quite a number of years. but it has that. But for instance, Dr. Sray cannot look in my journal, and I will not be able to look in her journal. So it's really that much of a complement size. And the point is that even among journals, how bad it sounds, we cannot even look at these other journals, not even what papers are submitted. Having said that, the databases do include the other papers. Your question. Yeah.
I think
There was an intention to ask a question. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And if any of you have a question, just ask to the chairperson. No, you can send me an email. You can find my email and address. And don't hesitate. I will try to answer the questions. Unfortunately, I do get a lot of questions, and I try to answer most of them. But feel free. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Henrik, for giving me excellent, informative. In fact, I remember when Sri came to me, I jumped. I said, "You tell what needs to be done." Right. So it was there, and soon we'll meet after lunch again. Now, the chance is to come here, and the small token of this is from our side.
We meet again.
This is completely in-house art.
This looks like a woodpecker.
They're all our friends inside the campus. All our campus.
Okay, well, but I will stay on this one. I mean, this is really material science. How is a woodpecker able to actually hit his head so fast? Because it's like 200 G without getting a brain injury. I would love to know. I would be the best boxer in the world. Thank you very much.
Now, if it's them, it's D in the school of physics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, James. Thank you.
Go for lunch now.
Yes. I hope they're still open for lunch.
I got two. Yeah, good questions. Excellent. Can I just leave?